Get this thing on.
That could help.
A little bit. Oh.
That helps. Just a wee bit.
Oh well, I have a loud voice. You guys can all hear me. It's a small room.
What?
Doesn't matter. You can just pretend that you know what I'm saying. All right. So, welcome to the Power of Mana, or if you're expecting this, this is also the Power of Lore. Today and only today, there are 2 names for this panel. You lucky, lucky people. So, my name is Aydan Fullbuster. I am also WYSIWYG Visions on Facebook. I'm the cosplay director here, so if you came yesterday and checked out our awesome events, I helped out with that. We're going to have a lot of fun today. So what we're going to be covering today is the power of mana. So who here has heard of mana before? Probably in video games, you might have heard it in movies, you might have heard it in conjunction with Moana if you've watched that. So we're going to be talking about where this comes from in real-world mythology. But before I get into that, I just want to give a quick story about how this panel came to be. So my mom has an anthropology and archaeologist background. To give you an idea, who here has played Tales of Symphonia? Are you familiar with the character Rain?
Hell yeah!
My mom is a real-world Rain. It is so much fun going to museums with her because she has a museum mode that is the exact same as Rain's archaeology mode. It is very interesting. But in any case, as you might have guessed, I really liked the Tales of series, and I was telling my mom about it, and my mom got really interested, so she started playing some of the games. She played Link and Ray's, rest in peace,
Rest in peace.
And she came up to me. It had to have been like 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. I was getting ready to go to bed. I had an early shift at work the next day. She burst into my room and says, "Why didn't you tell me that they used mana?" Like, hold on, Mom. I'm in my pajamas. I'm about ready to crawl into bed. Why are we so excited about mana? And so she based a lot of her things and a lot of her studies herself on mana and on a lot of the mythology of mana, and apparently wrote this big paper on it once upon a time. So she's the one that inspired the power of mana and actually helped me do a lot of the research for this panel. Adulting happens.
Give her a high five for me.
I will give her a high five for you and let her know that all of this is a thing. So before I go much further, I don't really have any major spoilers in this panel. I do have some minor spoilers for Tales of Fantasia and Tales of Symphonia, but not anything earth-shattering. Okay, so mana, it originated in Pacific Islander culture in terms of mythology and Polynesian culture. And it is described as a force that penetrates and binds all living things. So if you're familiar with the Force from the Star Wars universe, it's very, very similar to that. So it's something that is everywhere. It's like this cosmic energy. And to have mana means that you have influence, authority, and efficiency. So the ability to perform in a given situation. And it's definitely an idea, somebody that's strong in mana is generally somebody that's a leader and a mover and a shaker. And the quality of mana isn't necessarily contained just in humans, but it's in objects and the environment as well. So it's kind of like this ethereal force. And it really defines down to spiritual energy and healing. And it's also described as the thunder, storm, and wind. It dates back to animism, which is the religious belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess distinct spiritual essence. So it's kind of like how everything has a slightly different aura. And depending on what the object is, depending on who the person is, depending on where they're at, this can change, modify and suit different situations. So it began in animism and then continued to evolve with the Polynesian culture into pre-animism, which, despite the name, came after animism, because that makes sense. Also, if any of you have any questions as I go through, don't hesitate to hold your hand up. I also save room at the end of the presentation for more questions. So objects can hold a whole lot of mana. So some great examples of that in the Tales of series is Tipo. So for those of you that have played Tales of Xillia, Tipo is a booster, which means that he is able to enhance the abilities and enhance the mana in Elise, who is his holder. So in this case, Tipo himself is a mana-filled object, but it's more of a boost to support and to magnify the mana of somebody else. So the mana he has can't necessarily be used in and of itself. This mana has to be used in conjunction with something else. So mana can be used for oneself, but mana can also enhance the abilities of somebody else. Another example is the mana seeds in Tales of Fantasia. So the mana seeds are these really powerful seeds that grow into this really strong, bright tree. But the mana seeds can also provide support and abilities and strength to their holders. So in terms of mana-filled objects, the objects themselves do have mana, but the mana is really used to enhance the abilities of their holder. And in this case, usually the holder has to have some sort of distinct type of mana or some special ability in order to work in conjunction with it. How many of you have watched Voltron before? I know you have. So you can kind of think of it as that, like the Paladins and the Alliance. The Paladins have these special abilities and key characteristics, but they have to work in conjunction with the Alliance, which also have these key characteristics. Not just anyone can pilot a lion, and it's the same idea with these mana-filled objects. Not just anyone can use Tipo or the mana seeds, but it does require somebody with special abilities and special mana themselves. Any questions thus far about objects? All right, moving on. So I talked about how people have to have mana too, and that's definitely the case in the Tales of series, as well as lots of other examples in throughout. So in Polynesian culture, somebody that had mana would be somebody that had a lot of special abilities. So this could be their chiefs. They have this special leadership ability and this charisma, which would be this overflowing of the mana that they have. Another example would be witch doctors or healers. They believe that the mana that they have gave them the abilities to use herbal remedies or special stones to heal the people in their tribes. In the Tales of series, as well as almost any other video game or movie or TV show, mana is usually what powers them in terms of magical abilities and arts. So we have Mila Maxwell, Lord of Spirits, Lord in the abilities and leader of all of these magical beings that are essentially composed of mana. More to come on that later. Spoilers, dearie. And she herself is overflowing with this overabundance of mana, which she is then able to channel into all these super powerful arts until she gets them stripped away. But that's also what allows this Kresnik gun to work. And I'm not going to get much further into that because I don't want to get too many spoilers. But Mila Maxwell, this overabundance of mana, if you look at the Polynesian culture, is one of the key aspects that allows her to be such an influential leader. It gives her the charisma, it gives her leadership, it gives her power. And that same idea can be attributed to Gaius, if you want to look at a human counterpart. Gaius, who I do not have pictured up here, is also this strong, powerful, somewhat solemn leader. But if you're to attribute this to the Polynesian culture, one of the things that allows him to be this strong leader is this overabundance of mana, which just wells out in leadership and charisma and these powerful attacks. We also see that over here in Tales of Fantasia with Arche. Klaus a little bit, but Klaus, so for those of you that don't know, Arche is a witch who is able to use arts. And it's this ability and it's this mana that she has, this overwhelming mana, that allows her to use these magical abilities. Klaus, on the other hand, is not able to use the abilities, is not able to use arts in and of himself. However, he does have mana affinity, which allows him to use objects to cast his arts and spells instead. So there's two different ways that people can use mana. People can use mana to cast arts themselves, or they have mana that allows them to use magical objects and acquire an affinity for them.
Question.
Yes.
With the people, is it possible for person to person to be able to share the mana and to make more powerful arts?
More to come on that later.
Ah.
Finally, there are places, highly spiritual places, that are overflowing with mana. And it's these places themselves that might give somebody a special ability, or you might be able to do certain things in these places that you won't be able to do anywhere else. The ancient Hawaiians and the ancient Polynesians fought lots of battles to possess these. One of those is the island of, I'm sorry, I know I'm going to butcher these names, but the island of Molokai, which contains this huge volcano, which is this big symbol of power. This volcano was believed to power almost the entire island. It's a huge, highly spiritual place which provides power and it provides mana for the people that possess it and for the people that live there. You can also see this idea pretty well across the world, just in different forms. So how many of you have seen a Miyazaki film before? Have you noticed that Miyazaki really likes big trees? Yeah? It's the same idea as with mana. These big trees are a source of mana. It's a source of power, and it's a source of life. Mana is like a source of life. Yes?
Did the big trees also come from Polynesian culture, or did it come from Norse mythology?
That more came from Norse mythology as well as Japanese mythology. So while I'm talking about mana, some of the specificities of mana came from Polynesian culture. However, all of these different cultures developed parallel mythologies. So the same idea, but just different words and different iterations. So the Japanese have this great idea behind mountains, thanks to Mount Fuji, and really big trees, and that these are like a source of life and swirling mana. Some other cultures believe that highly spiritual places like this might be closer to the world of the gods or closer to the world of the spirits. And so while the Polynesians also attribute giant trees, when it comes to Miyazaki, that's a combination of Japanese mythology, Norse mythology, probably with a little bit of Polynesian thrown in. Good question. So in the Tales universe, a couple of notable locations is the Yggdrasil tree, or the World Tree, which we see reappear in many, many different games. And usually we see the World Tree almost as a rectification for events. It's that elixir that helps fix things and bring the world back on track. And sometimes the heroes don't even know that's what needs to be done, but it ends up being kind of the fix. Some of the other ways that we see the World Tree is the World Tree starts to die, or the World Tree something happens to the World Tree. Words are hard today, bear with me. Something happens to the World Tree, and that's when things start to go wrong. Because the World Tree is a symbol of life, it's a symbol of power, and that's what allows us to keep moving forward in the game story. Another example is the Hollowmont in Tales of Xillia, pictured over here on your right with Luger. So the Hollowmont in Tales of Xillia is this big spiritual mountain. And in the game, it's on this mountain that we end up getting the dimensional breach, which allows us to move from Rize Maxia up to Olympias. The reason why this dimensional breach happens here is because this is a place that is teeming with mana. It's a highly spiritual place. At the base of this mountain is Mila Maxwell's shrine. There's a reason it's there. It's because this is a spiritual place. It is overflowing with mana, and it gives you different abilities there. It, in and of itself, is important, almost like a character. All right. Any questions so far before I move on? All right. There we go. So there are different ways to acquire mana. And, okay, so there's different ways to acquire mana. And it really boils down to two different ideas. Pono, which is right actions. So you have to do the right things. You have to dance the right steps in order to acquire this mana and to acquire this connection to this power. So when you're talking about the Polynesians love counterparts. Everything has counterpart. Everything is dualistic. There's light and there's dark. There's hot and there's cold. Which one the coffee is, I don't know. And when it comes to mana, that dualistic nature comes between two gods, Ku and Lono. Ku is the god of war and politics. And the idea with this is mana through violence. Now, when I say violence, I don't necessarily mean you run around with a sword chopping up monsters, although that is a good way to level brains. It means that you do some sort of action. You do a thing, and then you get something. You go on a side quest. You defeat a certain number of monsters. You find a lost cat. And when you do this, when you complete this task, then you get a new ability. So in Tales of series, think of it as you go off on a side quest, such as Guy's side quest, and you're able to get a new art, or you get a new ability, or you get some new gels. You do something, you get something in return. Another great example is in Tales of Symphonia with Colette in the Path of Regeneration. So at the beginning of the game, you have to visit all of these different shrines and locations. You have to go through all of the monsters, and each time you do, Colette unlocks another ability. She becomes more and more of an angel. And that would be action means of violence, and that would be the god Ku. Now the second god is Lono, who is the god of fertility. So the god of fertility and the god of kindness. So in this case, rather than doing something, you feel something. So maybe you feel kindness towards somebody. Maybe you feel empathy towards somebody. Maybe you feel love towards somebody. So this is like the power of love, or dare I say it, the magic of friendship. So this isn't seen quite as often in the Tales of games. I mean, you have Tales of Graces, which might as well be Tales of Friends. Because it's their friendship that makes everything happy and pastel-y. You also see this quite a bit in Tales of Xillia. So in Tales of Xillia, you have, for those of you that haven't played, you have humans and you have spirits. So humans, specifically Rize Maxian, have something that's called a mana lobe. And the mana lobe is what allows them to channel mana and produce mana so that they can use arts. And spirits are beings that are composed of mana. Now, if they start to run short of mana, they can do something that's called tethering, where they're able to draw mana directly from the mana lobe of the Rize Maxian. And it is considered a bit of a sexual act in the game. But this is an excellent example of the god Lono. The god Lono is the god of fertility, the god of feelings, the god of connection, the god of tethering. Who knew that Lono was actually a spirit?
Not so alone.
Let's not feel Lono about this.
The scene in Xillia 2 where, never mind.
Stay on target. Are there any questions about the path to mana? All right, and we are walking. Okay, so I was talking earlier that there are people that are strong in mana. And these people play a huge role in Polynesian culture. In Polynesian mythology, it was believed that it was the people that are strong in mana that change the course of history. It's the people that are strong in mana that are the movers and shakers, and they are the ones we want to follow. They are the ones that make things different. Now it's just like when Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Mana in and of itself is not good or evil. It is simply a power. It is a thing that exists. There's a dark side and there is a light side. So you can have heroes, you can have your chieftains, you can have the people that use it for right. However, you also have people that can be strong in mana that are bad. They're your antagonists, and they're the people that are trying to change the course of history down a dark direction. So some people have an affinity for mana, some people do not. And the people that have the affinity for mana are believed to be destined to do great things. It is written in stone. If you are bequeathed with mana, if you have the ability to use these mana-filled objects, then it is your destiny to do great things. You are on a set path to move and change the course of history and sometimes the course of the world. So this includes chiefs, it includes religious leaders, and most importantly, these are the heroes. How many of you have played Tales of Rage before? Okay, a few of you have. Again, rest in peace, North American Tales of Rage. I need a moment. Okay, I'm better now.
Pay respect.
I had to pay respects. Alright, so Tales of Rage. In Tales of Rage, there are these characters called Nexus characters. So the premise of Tales of Rage, for those of you that have not played, is that you play as characters that are on the world of Tir Nanog, which is also really interesting. Come see me if you have questions about Tir Nanog later. And Tir Nanog is literally falling apart, and they need the help of other heroes from other worlds in order to save their own world. So they make connections and bridges, essentially, with all of these different worlds, and they pull characters called Nexus heroes from those worlds into Tir Nanog. Copies of them. They make copies of them. Thank you.
Replicas.
Replicas. They make replicas of everyone.
Would you say it's like a mirror?
It's like a mirror reflection, almost a mirage of sorts. And so what makes these Nexus heroes so powerful? How can these Nexus heroes change the course of Tir Nanog? And it's because they're destined to do so because they are so full of mana. Now, these heroes have already changed the course of history in their own life and in their own world. But they're so overflowing with mana that they're also going to change the course of history in Tir Nanog, which I think is super cool. Now, how do you access mana? So there's all this power. There's all this power that's just kind of there. There's different ways that these heroes are able to access it, but the two most common ways are spells and prayers, like Miss Colette over there. So one of the ways that Colette is able to access her power is by praying to the gods, is by praying to these mana beings. And then the other way is by spells and incantations. So by saying the right thing and by doing the right things, just like Lono and Ku. Yes?
Would another good comparison be the way Tyr does?
Yes, Tyr would be an excellent example of that. So Tyr is able to access her mana by singing her songs, and that's like singing in a spell. So by doing the right things and saying the right things, by doing Ku and Lono, just like on our last slide, we are able to access mana and then use it. So mana is a distinct power. One of the things that is also interesting about mana is anime. Not anime, anime. So anime is the manifestation of mana as an independent power, and it exists independently from its source. So think of it this way. There's such a huge concentration of mana in one place, in one location, that it becomes its own identity. It is no longer like an electrical force. It's no longer like a power source that we've seen to power spells and arts and mystic arts. It becomes conscious, just like our spirits. So spirits of themselves are concentrations of mana, and that's why they have all these strong abilities, and that's also why it takes so much TP to summon them, because not only are you using TP to connect with them, you're using TP to bring them to you, and these are already beings that are completely full of mana, which is super cool. So it's described as the power of awfulness. Awful not as this big, bad, terrible thing, but awful as something that is full of awe and wonder. So there are things that possess and impress an observer with, I quote, respect, veneration, appropriation, service that emanates from a mana's power. So when you have this big concentration of mana, it's different than when a hero has a lot of mana. So these mana beings, which I'm just going to call spirits for ease of use, when they have special abilities that humans never can have because they themselves are composed of mana. This means that they can possess the abilities of a place that has mana, an object that has mana, so they can impart mana to others, or they can choose to be a person, similar to Milo Maxwell, or some of the other spirits that we see. The other thing that is interesting about this is that when you have large concentrations of mana, it might become sentient, but it might not. The Polynesian culture believed that when you have big concentrations of mana, that's what causes natural phenomena, like thunderstorms, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes. It's when there's too much mana in a place, things happen. Either it becomes sentient, or it just starts to destroy everything. Not much of anything in between. So that's what I have so far on the power of mana. Do any of you have any questions? Yes.
When you say that the mana overflows, so basically the earth cannot absorb anymore. It's almost like a major rainstorm, like in a desert where you get flash floods.
So when a person has so much mana that overflows, it's similar to if you have a cup of water and you start pouring water in. Some people have a capacity to have a little bit of mana, but not enough to do anything with. But as you pour more and more and more mana into this cup of water, it overflows into the environment. In terms of these natural phenomena and things like that, it's not necessarily that the earth doesn't have the capacity to have all that mana or house all of that mana. It's because all that mana is now in a single location rather than dispersed out.
So like Vesperia.
Yes.
What was it?
Vesperia.
Oh.
It is the premise of Vesperia.
Won't go further than that for spoilers.
Good call. Good question. Any other questions?
What's
Yes.
the world of Tirnog based on?
Oh, I'm glad somebody asked me.
That's Irish mythology, isn't it?
That is Irish mythology.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So
That
the
was weird.
world of Tirnog is the world of the little people in the Irish mythology. So that's where the leprechauns are. That's where the fairies are. That's where the fays are. That's where all these little people live. So there's a couple of different mythologies when it comes to Tirnog. But the most common is that it's this underground kingdom that lives underneath Ireland. And there's all these different portals that fall down into Tirnog. And that's what the little people use to come back to the surface, usually to cause shenanigans. The other thing about Tirnog is that time passes differently in Tirnog as compared to our world.
Mm-hmm.
So there's several stories of children tumbling into Tirnog, having a grand afternoon, and then coming back up, and it's the Rip Van Winkle effect. Everything's changed. That's it in a nutshell. But it's super fun. Check out some of the Irish mythology around Tirnog. They are so much fun. I thought I saw a hand back here. Any other questions? Yes.
You were talking about objects being like the trees and mountains being full of mana. What about places like, you hear a lot, we need to travel to this holy place, so we need to go to this place because it's safe. The only one I'm pulling to mind is the Great Valley from The Land Before Time, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I talked about kind of iconic objects as being places that are filled with mana. But if we take your example of the Great Valley from Land Before Time, that would also be considered a place filled with mana. So we're going to do a little bit of experiment. I want all of you to imagine your favorite desert. Are you imagining your favorite desert? Natalia, not that desert, choose a different one.
Technically a desert.
Yeah, but it's not the right type of desert. Choose a different one. Okay, that one's better. So I'm pretty sure that when you're picturing your desert, there's a lot of sand, there might be a few cacti. I hope there's lots of lizards because I like lizards. Lots of rocks. It's very dry, arid, not a lot of life there. But once you add water, everything changes. All of a sudden, you have these wildflowers that burst into life. You have grasses, you have little bushes, you have all of this life. And if you listen really carefully, you might even be able to hear rain frogs, which come out of the ground from hibernation when there's just enough water. And in a single night, while it's still cool, they'll eat, breed, and then go back underground to hibernate until the next rain.
Me.
What happened? Water was added. Water was the source of life. And you can think of water like the manna. So once you add manna, once you add water, life is able to abound. Now let's take a look at that Great Valley again from Land Before Time.
It's a really good movie.
When Littlefoot and his dinosaur friends were going to the Great Valley, what were they seeing? They were seeing death. They were seeing a lack of food. There wasn't any water. What water was left was usually muddy and dirty. It was arid. Nothing was able to grow. They practically died themselves. And rather than really seeing a lot of other herbivores, there was only carnivores. But once they reached that Great Valley, everything was green and lush because of water and because of manna. So think of manna like water, adding water into an environment. Another way that you can think of this is for those of you that have played Tales of Graces with Fodra. When the party first arrives at Fodra, the moon is dank. It's arid, there really isn't any life there. What monsters are left are just these kind of rat-taggedy monsters that just want to kill you like every other monster. But as soon as manna is reintroduced into the environment, it bursts into life. And Pascal herself even said it, that it used to be full of life and then it became nothing. But once manna was reintroduced, life came back. Yes?
It just made me think of manna transferring from one place to the other. What if, to use some funny as an example, what if two particular worlds are fighting over a single source of mana?
And that's where things get interesting. So what if two worlds are fighting over a single source of mana? And with that, you're going to start getting into multidimensional theory, which is also super fun. I love quantum physics. So that's something that's a little bit more theoretical. But what you're looking at there is that you have a finite source of mana and too much need for it. And that's when you start running into issues, and that's when you start having this lack of mana, and that's where things start dying. And that's when you run into civil wars and angels and all sorts of fun things. So there's not really any exact answer, but it's similar to rain shadows. So a rain shadow is when you have usually some sort of big natural barrier that prevents rain clouds from going into a certain area. On one side of the mountain, such as here in Washington with the Cascades, if you look at western Washington, it's green and lush, and it's the Emerald State. But if you look at eastern Washington, it's dry, it's arid, it's hot because of this rain shadow, because something is blocking the rain clouds from going there as often. It's the same thing as with Symphonia. Something is blocking it, or at least for certain periods of time, from going to another area, creating a mana shadow. That answer your question? Comment? Thing?
Observation.
Awesome. Observation? Any other thoughts, comments, questions, or cookies? Yes?
Seraphim from Tales of Zestiria.
Seraphim from Tales of Zestiria. Very similar to the spirits that we were looking at earlier. And that is actually a really interesting thing to delve into. So how many of you have played Tales of Zestiria before? Okay, most of you have. For those of you who haven't, and this isn't exactly a spoiler, Seraphim are like spirits. So they're these abilities that have, we'll say that they're spirits that are essentially composed of mana. They're composed of energy. And they are all distinct individuals. They have their own distinct abilities. But they're not able to be seen by everyone. Only people that have a high resonance, like a high spiritual ability, are able to see or hear the seraphim. So if you think of it this way, seraphim are composed of mana. And only people that are high in mana themselves that contain this ability to see the spirits. So this goes back to when we were talking about how some people have an affinity for mana, some people do not, and some people are kind of right in the middle. So let's take a look at our cast of characters. We have Soray, the shepherd. Soray is very, very high in mana, very, very high in resonance, and it is his destiny to save the world. Then we have Rose. Rose is also high in mana and high in resonance. She is able to eventually see the spirits when see the seraphim when she's introduced to them, even though she does think they're ghosts initially. And then we have Alicia. Alicia is a very interesting character. She is the princess of, she's one of the princesses of one of the countries, and she is in a position of power, and she is in a position to try to change the world. However, she doesn't have quite the same resonance as her friends do. She's only able to sense and hear seraphim when she is in contact with Soray. So Soray is able to use his mana as a conduit for those that have lesser resonance. It's very interesting when you think about it. Thanks for bringing up Zesty. All right, we'll go with Annie and then Cam.
Wanted to continue on with Zestiria because you go into Busteria at the beginning when Velvet escapes from the prison, and she ends up taking, she absorbs the monsters and she gains their powers.
Yes. So that's also interesting. And that's kind of where you go into good mana versus bad mana, mana of a curse of sorts. Because the monster mana wouldn't necessarily be the good guy hero type mana. However, Velvet in and of herself is a person that is high in mana. She has this affinity for mana to the point where she's able to absorb the mana of other beings. Unfortunately, the beings that she absorbs them from don't use good mana. And that's where we get the demon arm from. And that's where she gets her abilities. Because she herself, you can almost think of her as being neutral. Where she wasn't necessarily a good mana, she wasn't necessarily a bad mana, but the mana that she absorbed into herself and the mana that she then continued to utilize was this evil mana, which became her demon arm. What she chose to do with that mana then defined her as either a hero or an antagonist. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Cam was next, then we'll go to you.
It actually piggybacks off of both of those.
Oh,
talking
excellent.
about the seraphim and talking about bad mana, I wanted to talk about seraphim without spoiling anything, corruption in Zestiria, without spoiling anybody or any fire-breathing bad guys.
Understandable. All right, corruption. So for those of you who have not played Zesty or Visceria, corruption occurs when negative feelings and negative actions and negative thoughts, aura almost, corrupts an individual. And it can turn them into different things. It can also affect the decisions that they make and how they think about things. It influences their perspectives. And that would be that overabundance of negative mana. So mana, like I mentioned, is in and of itself neutral. The thing that causes it to kind of sway in one direction or another depends on the user. So if the user starts to go down a certain path, the mana is going to follow. And that's what we see happening in Zestiria and Visceria, is that the mana continues to, this negative feeling and this negative connotation for the mana continues to build and build and build and build and build until it overflows and becomes one of these places of power that we saw. There's such a high concentration of mana that it manifests itself, embeds itself in the people and in the environment to create this smoky haze. Kind of like the smoke that we all saw in Washington last summer. But what we also see is that, like we said, the mana in and of itself is not evil. Once the ray comes and is able to fix the environment, is able to purify this malevolence, things go back to normal. It's like that mana was then dispersed back out and things calm down. Because he is the hero destined to save everything.
It was also something I was thinking about, that they also explain part of corruption being a lack of belief in the spirits.
So lack of belief in the spirits also causes corruption. So one of the things I mentioned is that one of the paths to mana is through prayer and devotion. And that's the path through Lono. So Lono is through devotion, it's through feelings, it's through connections. And that's what helps stabilize everything. So Ku is the path of mana through violence and through action and through war. So which is often the path towards negative mana. So when you abandon one path towards mana, the path of Lono, and adopt the path through Ku, that's when you start to fall into some of these different connotations and start down the path of malevolence. All right, you had a question?
How to answer with his.
All right. Yeah, 2 birds with 1 stone. We're doing on time. Cool, 15 minutes still. Yes.
So, back to, I noticed in a lot of anime, like, some people can see yokai and some people can't. Back in olden Japan, it was believed only people of noble blood could see yokai.
Yeah.
Is that because they have a lot of mana?
Exactly. They have high spiritual power, which is usually what the Japanese would call it, is they have high spiritual power and resonance, which allows them to be able to see yokai. They're able to see beings that are also composed of spiritual power, or they might come from a different realm, which is also really interesting when you get into that. So it's the same idea that you see here. It's that idea that I talked about with parallel cultural mythology development. It's the same idea, 2 different countries. But with Japan, it would be high spiritual power, because it almost mirrors and reflects the same spiritual energy, be it positive or negative, in the yokai. That's what allows them to see the yokai and other monsters, whereas other people are unable to. So same idea. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
So in Symphonia, we're talking about how mana is the people destined for greatness usually have mana. How does that work with the genetics of elvish blood in Symphonia? Because I know.
All right, and then I knew somebody was going to bring that up. And that actually comes up in quite a few different games.
Mm-hmm.
So how do the genetics of elves versus humans affect mana?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that depends on the mythology, but a lot of people believe, and a lot of mythology holds, that other races other than humans have a higher affinity for mana. So it's almost like they were born with a little additional mana added in, which if you look at mythology, often those are the races that help shape or at least start the ball rolling for changes in humanity. But one of the issues that you run into with a lot of these races that are high in mana in and of themselves is that everybody is, therefore nobody is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so they have all of this spiritual power and all the spiritual abilities. And they a lot of them almost become akin to the yokai that we were talking about, where they're removed from humanity. As no one, I'm sure, will ever be surprised, most mythology is very human-centric. Humans are the center of the stories usually. And they usually have to go to these other races in order to get those powers or to develop those connections. So mana is already established in the culture for elves, for yokai, for the leprechauns, first thing I thought of. And as we saw in Tales of Symphonia, there was mana in the human cultures. However, they weren't necessarily able to take care of it or be able to channel it themselves without the help of elves, without the help of dwarves, without the help of Kreskis. And so these other races are usually the mentors. They're usually the people that have the knowledge. They're usually the people that have the ability to help the heroes of the story complete their task to change the course of human history. Most mythology that you read is very focused on the course of human history and human affairs, and don't care too much about the affairs of other worlds. Tales of Symphonia is a little bit different because the two races are more closely intermingled. They didn't start out that way, but they became that way, and that's where you get into a lot of racism. But because they evolved differently, elves tend to have a little bit higher resonance, which gives them their position of power. Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right, yes?
This just but could the argument be made to use Symphonia and perhaps Assyria to a degree as an example? Races or groups that were born into areas with high mana concentrations versus groups that were born in areas with poor mana concentrations. Could it be argued that the ones born in high concentrations are more likely to evolve a culture that focuses more on keeping those traditions and therefore become more, to use the phrase, mana-centric or elf-like, whereas the one in poor concentrations have to rely on the land and become more, the only word I can think of is industrialized?
That is absolutely the case. So the question was, or the comment was, we could use the idea of cultures that are born into areas with high mana concentrations, that mana manifestations, they become more mana-centric as they evolve, as compared to those that are not. And that is absolutely the case. And that's one of the reasons why, when I was talking about areas and mountains and forests that have high mana concentrations are fought over, is because that is exactly the case. So people that live there have more ready access to the mana. It becomes part of their culture. Another great example of that, and you might be bringing this up, is Tales of Xillia. So for Tales of Xillia, warning, spoiler alert, there's two different worlds. You have WYSIWYG, which is this world that is teeming with mana. You have spirits that live there. You have lush forests. You have all these different ecosystems. You have art users. You have mystic art users. You have all this power and ability. And then once we go up to Olympus, you have deserts. You really don't have anyone that can use mana or has mana lobes, which I can talk to you about later if you want. You don't have mana users. You don't have this connection to mana. In the course of the story, WYSIWYG and Olympus have been separated for, I believe it was 500 years, from something called a schism. And that's exactly what we're seeing there. Is the culture that grew up 500 years on WYSIWYG is very mana-centric, to use your term. They do everything with mana. They developed the ability to light their streets using mana. Their doctors use mana to heal people. Your place in society is determined by your connection to mana and by your ability to produce mana and therefore produce these arts. People with high mana are the movers and shakers, and they're the leaders, as we saw with King Dias. When you go over to Olympus, they didn't have mana. Instead, they created much more of an industrialized society. So you had electricity, you have trains, you have medical advancements using mechanical things as compared to spiritual things. So you have two cultures that developed independent of each other, parallel along the same path, but ended up in two very different places simply because of the presence of mana or the lack thereof. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right, thank you so much for showing up. Thanks for coming here to Radiant Northwest. I've definitely had a lot of fun, and I hope that all of you have too. And enjoy your last day. Just a quick reminder, our silent auction is going to be ending here at 12 o'clock, so if there's anything that you really want, go ahead and check it out. Artist Alley is going to be opening in 30 seconds. So thanks